webinars that are hosted by the Global African Worker Institute. This institute is under the auspices of the Coalition for Black Trade Unionists. And in a nutshell, I can describe our objectives as to promote solidarity amongst workers of African descent the world over, to help us in confronting the challenges that face us, but providing our own solutions as well to those challenges. I'm really delighted to have with us today an amazing panel. Couldn't have hoped for a better one, even if we are still missing one of our panelists. But before I get into that, for those who have joined us via the Zoom link, I just want to point out that interpretation is available. So if you go to the globe icon at the bottom of your screen, you can select the language of your choice to listen into. And it helps if after selecting your language, you press mute original audio. So then you will only hear the interpretation feed come into your ears. So, and also to say to those who are joining us that please do feel free to place comments, questions to the panelists in the chat box. We would like the session to be as interactive as possible. We have just under 90 minutes, I think, at our disposal. We will see whether we use the full 90 minutes, but I'm hoping for a really lively and engaging discussion. So hopefully we will. Without further ado, let me present the panelists that we have today. And I know I'm not going to do them justice in my presentation because each and every one of them amazing activists and experts in their field who have been tackling these issues for years and whose insights I really can't wait to listen to and hear. We have with us Wilf Sullivan, who's the Race Equality Officer at the Trade Unions Congress in the United Kingdom. We have Ojeko Nwoyo, who is the Senior Researcher at the European Network Against Racism and who's been doing quite a lot of work since the start of this pandemic in tracking its impact on Black and racialized people across Europe. And then delighted also to have with us Roger Mackenzie, who is the Assistant General Secretary of Unison, which is the largest public sector union in the United Kingdom, organizing workers across the health and care sectors. And of course, those workers have been in the front line of this pandemic. And as we know, Black people and Black women in particular, hugely overrepresented, if I can put it that way, compared to their presence in general populations in our care and health sectors. And unfortunately, usually experiencing the worst and most precarious conditions as well in those sectors. So unions, of course, are extremely vital to improving those working conditions and giving voice to those workers to assertively defend their own rights at work. So maybe I can start off with Wilf. Wilf, if there's anything you want to add to the way that I've introduced you, which I don't think did you justice at all, please do so. I should probably also introduce myself. I'm Chidi King. I'm the Director of Equality at the International Trade Union Confederation and a member of the Global African Workers Institute, and also your moderator for this particular series. And again, before turning to Wilf, I should just point out that we have a number of members of the of GAWI present with us here. Just briefly mention them. So we have Kwazi, who is the General Secretary of the ITUC Africa, so the regional organization in Africa of the International Trade Union Confederation. We have Mercedes joining us from Italy. We have Agripina joining us from Colombia. And we have Farid, who has been instrumental in putting this program together with us. So great to have you all with us as well. So, Wilf, you are, the Race Equality Officer of the Trade Union Confederation in the UK. So I'm going to ask you to give us an overview of how COVID is playing out in the UK, what trade unions are doing in relation to Black and racialized workers. And in the UK, of course, you're not only just confronting this pandemic, but the pandemic arrives just as a transition period for Brexit comes to an end. Brexit, no doubt, was also very much an expression of the discrimination, racism, inequalities that exist in UK society, but not only. So your reflections on all of these are very welcome.
Good, Johnny. It's a lot to come. How long have I got? We only had 90 minutes.
Exactly. Yes. Bear that in mind.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
I'll cut you off if you're going too long in your initial intervention.
I will try to be brief. I will be brief. I mean, thanks for the introduction. I mean, I'll start off by saying that when the COVID pandemic first hit, I was asked at the TUC what people thought, by people, what I thought the policy issues would be for the TUC to deal with in the context of the pandemic. And my answer was quite short, really. I just said people are going to die, and I don't think anybody, I mean, my colleagues actually really understood what I meant or how this would actually play out. Until actually the pictures started going up on the TV screen of who was actually dying. And, you know, what you saw was loads of black faces. And when the official statistics came out, which showed that basically people in black communities were 4.5 times more likely to die from COVID-related deaths than in the white population, that started a debate, and I'll talk a little bit about the politics of the debate, both in terms of management response, government response, and then a little bit about trade union response. But I mean, one of the things that it showed was the systemic inequality in labour markets that had always been there. It just shone a light on that. And one of the things that we eventually did was a report called "Dying on the Job." Not a particularly popular title in my institution, but I insisted that that's what it should be, which really concentrated on the overexposure of black workers to the COVID virus in terms of both where they were in the labour market, in terms of the types of jobs that people were doing, the lack of response from employers, and other related issues that were going on, like excessive scrutiny and a lack of support if they if people were furloughed and at home. That the harassment and abuse that was going on as a result of people trying to get employers to take account of situations that they found themselves in terms of trying to support their families while they were dealing with bereavements, they were dealing with illnesses, the lack of social support in terms of decent sick pay, that a lot of people were in a disproportionately in insecure employment, and therefore a lot of the mainstream kind of furlough schemes and support schemes didn't apply to them. The problems around people who were migrant workers and who had no recourse to public funds. And of course, the general difficulties that if you are experiencing racism in the workplace, that the difficulties of actually raising that and getting anything done about that. And constantly we see research in the UK which shows that though people will say they suffer from racism, they don't raise it because often they fear reprisals, and quite rightly fear reprisals, or they don't think management will do anything sufficient. And, I think one of the things about that report, one of the responses, because what we did within it was actually put a call out and ask people to relate their stories of how they were treated during the pandemic. And for me, one of the things was to try and bust the myth that nowadays racism is much more subtle. It's not in your face like it used to be in the 70s and 80s, people say. And of course, there's always been racism that's been subtle, but there's also been racism that's in your face. And one story that particularly stuck with me was a woman from a care home who was the only black worker in the care home, who was assigned the job of washing the bodies of the elderly people that had died from COVID. There's nothing subtle about that. Blatantly putting black workers in the front line in terms of exposure. And I suppose, in terms of responses to this, and I said I'll talk about management response first, but I'll talk about government response first. That what immediately began to happen was a medicalised debate about why it was that black workers were disproportionately dying from COVID. And it was almost like this was an attempt to make this about people's bodies. So people were talking about comorbidities and, high blood pressure and all this stuff, as if somehow or other a pandemic and this particular virus was racialized. I mean, clearly, in terms of government responses, what the government started to do was set up inquiries to look at why it was that black people were dying disproportionately in a medical sense from COVID, and a difficult narrative to fight, and which we still are. Because clearly, in terms of the evidence that they were looking at, they wanted to discount racism and they wanted to discount issues about the kinds of jobs people were working in, which led to exposure. On top of that, there was a whole debate going on about risk assessment. And one of the dangers about this whole narrative was that employers, we all know, if they're presented with a risk, will and they feel that they have to do something about it, will minimise the risk in the simplest of way possible. And so, one of the side effects of this, and we've recently been looking at who's lost their jobs as a result of the pandemic, is that some employers have begun to think, well, actually, if black people are a risk in relation to getting the virus, then the best thing is not to have them in the workforce. That removes the risk. So there's that aspect of that kind of response going on as well. But in terms of government response, and it links to management response, really. In the UK, there's been a constant narrative around, the next lockdown or the next measure, and now it's the vaccine will solve the problem. And one of the things that has meant is that real measures to protect people in the workplace and more generally haven't been taken because, clearly from the government's point of view, we've got a government that is a neoliberal government that believes in small government, that does not believe in regulation of any form in the labour market, that actually requiring employers to put in place proper health and safety measures to protect workers is regulation. And if people want to do that voluntarily, that's fine. But if they don't, it doesn't. they might point out that there's a problem with it, but actually they won't enforce it. So in those terms, what that's allowed employers to do is to completely ignore problems of protection at work. And so we've seen, especially in things like social care, food processing, what is becoming a growing sort of textile industry. Lots of instances where I know in some meat processing plants, for example, where the employers finally been able to do a test of the workforce, like 50% of people have been tested positive to COVID, even more. And who are these workers? Often they're migrant workers. They're migrant workers from black communities as well. They're often agency workers. So the employer's attitude, well, as if somebody's got COVID, just tell the agency to replace them with somebody else. And there's no real social protections around this. And that's also in a context where I think, a lot of what you see in terms of measures that have been taken have been measures which have privileged large private sector corporations. So whether it's PPE, whether it's the provision of school meals to poor communities, often black communities, what you've seen is big private companies being given millions of pounds to provide a service that just does not happen. Now, I mean,
Well, I'm
I
gonna.
could go on, but I would just say in terms of trade union response, and I'll be honest here that I think that actually that there needed to be a bigger trade union response, especially in terms of actually highlighting problems around racism in the labour market and how that's impacted on black workers. But not only that, around potentially driving agenda and an agenda and negotiating agenda across all trade unions around what needed to happen in the workplace to make sure that workers were safe. Because we know in our communities people are in positions where a lot of people have to go out to work. And I hate the narrative around frontline workers as if somehow we're in a war. It's not frontline workers, it's workers that either have to go out to work because they're doing public service jobs, or quite simply they're workers that are working in low paid sectors where their employers are going to carry on the business, irrespective of what the government rules are, because actually it's about making money. But actually, if as a union movement we don't face up to the fact that actually, part of this is about exploitation, and that we actually have to get down to the detail of what that means in terms of work organisation, then we're not going to make progress. And I remember having to explain it to one of my colleagues like this. I said, if you've got 100 people in a factory that make 1,000 widgets, right? And the employers told them, well, you have to do social distancing, and they can only get 50 people in that factory. That's going to affect their production and their bottom line. If somebody doesn't make them do that, right, they will carry on squeezing 100 people into that factory. And that's the kind of thing that you see all over the place. I don't know if you want me to say anything about Brexit at this point, because I couldn't.
Yeah, we'll come back to that, but thank
Let's
you.
come back to that.
Yeah,
but I'll
exactly.
stop there because, yeah.
Great, and thanks for kicking us off. And we'll certainly, when we come to Roger, want to pick up again on some of the issues that you've highlighted, particularly around the disproportionate number of deaths that we've seen amongst black workers in the health and care services. And you've just given us a very concrete and graphic example of some of the reasons why. The discrimination that surrounds black workers in the workplace that can lead to this, but also I would imagine what you highlighted about the fears of raising concerns about racism have also contributed to the very high numbers, or disproportionately high numbers of deaths that we've seen amongst our communities. I just wanted to, because I don't think he was online when we were doing our introductions, but I just wanted to welcome and ask Ibrahim Anyan from CGIL in Italy, if he can hear me, to unmute himself and perhaps introduce himself. We're very happy to have him with us. He's the General Secretary of his trade union in Italy. Ibrahim, can you hear me? Maybe he stepped away from his computer. Mercedes, maybe you can send him just a quick note. Great, thank you. Just ask him to come back. And whilst we're waiting for that, I'll go to Ejeku now. I imagine that much of what Wilf has talked about is playing out across Europe, not just in the UK. And I know that from your vantage point at INA, you have been doing research, in fact, seeing how COVID and structural racism have impacted Black and racialized communities across Europe. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you. It'd be great if you could pick out some particular one or two examples from European countries as well to illustrate, but over to you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to contribute to this discussion. I think I'm really happy that Wilf went first, because he really did outline pretty much a lot of the things that we had found in our it's quite a small scale study that we did at first. But as soon as the pandemic really hit the shores of Europe, we started to hear from our members, and we have anti-racist organizations across Europe telling us about their particular experiences and what was happening. And of course, none of the work that we did in this area was planned. And we started to try and document. How can we document what is happening? What are the main areas that we need to address? And so my colleague really was able to do this small scale study where we were collecting information, collecting data on the impact of all racialized groups. So not specifically on one group in particular. INA works really on behalf of all racialized groups. And I think that all of the things that Wilf mentioned was becoming more and more apparent for us. I think we were kind of able to see how the pandemic was essentially shining a light on the existing inequalities. I think at first, when we started to do this data collection, we thought, okay, we've got to show how this is impacting in terms of health, or we have to show how this is impacting in terms of policing. But it became really clear that in all the areas that we, like systemic racism, in all of these areas that we know that there's racism and racial discrimination, we were seeing the impact of COVID. So definitely in terms of death, in terms of, these kind of like socioeconomic factors, we really saw that they were compounding. And so there's the element of race, racial discrimination, there's the element of poverty, there's the element of health, essentially. I know that Wilf was saying that it's not necessarily just to do with our genetics or whatever, but there are these compounding factors that I think that make it particularly a problem for racialized groups. Again, in employment, I think if it's a little bit unfortunate in Europe because we don't collect as great a data on different ethnic groups as you do in the UK. So it's hard to show the disproportionate impact in a clear statistical way. But we know already that in terms of employment and in terms of migration, there are certain groups that are in low-paid jobs, work in the informal market. And as soon as the pandemic hit and when we were having our lockdowns, this would impact on those workers. But then not only that, it's also the housing issue. So of course, minorities are not able, if they're living in certain conditions, to socially distance. So we had that. Access to healthcare was a hugely important thing, especially if you're an undocumented migrant or irregular migrant in Europe without. Well, I think in Belgium, also Chidi, you'll be able to tell me. I suspect in Belgium, if you're an undocumented or irregular migrant and you don't have an ID card, your access to healthcare, it's impossible. So I think these sorts of things were incredibly important that we were able to highlight through our data collection. And for me in particular, I've been working a lot on policing and looking at the connection to kind of COVID enforcement legislation and the impact with policing. And I think for us, this is one of the areas where we saw how racial profiling was increased under these new enforcement legislation, which was, police were given powers to do this enforcement, powers that we have not seen the police have for like most of our lives. So we could see how they would use these powers to discriminate against, and of course those groups within different European countries that were already mostly affected by racial profiling, we saw an increase. So in the UK, for example, we could see that there were, I think it was the, I mean, you have police statistics in the UK, so you could see that I think it was around about at least seven Black people out of 1,000 were subject to stop and search, rising to about above 9 out of 1,000 in April. So you can see how the increase in racial profiling was particularly targeting Black people in the UK, and through our documentation, we believe it was happening in many other European countries as well. I think it was you, Chidi, that said this virus apparently doesn't discriminate. But I think what I believe is that in a way, of course, it doesn't discriminate, but I think it really does highlight some of the systemic discrimination that Black people have faced across Europe in a way that I don't think that people had seen before or recognized in a way people before. So these are some of the main issues that we had started to document as part of our work. And I wonder if you want me to go into some of the responses, the EU responses now, or maybe later?
Yeah, we'll come back to them. Thank you very much, Ojako, for setting that out really, really clearly. And again, yeah, it's true. It struck me what you mentioned as well about the difficulty in collecting statistics concerning race across Europe. This is true. We know that in France, for instance, it's even unlawful to gather those statistics, which begs the question is how do you really measure and monitor what's happening on the ground if you're not able to do so. Again, I'm still not sure whether Ibrahima is with us, but in the meantime, while we're waiting to sort that out, want to go back to the UK and ask Roger Mackenzie, the Assistant General Secretary of Unison, from your perspective, Roger, again, sitting as a leader in the UK's largest public sector union, whose members are hugely impacted by this virus, but not only. What's the view from where you're sitting?
Okay, thanks, Chidi. And before I start, can I pay tribute and to my colleagues from GAWI who are on the call? It's really good to see you and be able to touch base with you all again. I suppose.
Okay, I should just interrupt you to say, my bad. Roger is actually a member of our executive board as well at GAWI, so I should have pointed that out in the in the introduction.
That's okay. That's okay. I suppose where I'd like to start. I don't want to repeat the excellent points that have been made by the two previous contributors, but I do want to share some of the experiences that we've had across the public services with this virus, but the particular experience of black workers. And I suppose last year, one of the most moving experiences that I had was just after George Floyd was murdered. I was asked by one of our local health branches to come and take a knee with them to show our support for Black Lives Matters. When I arrived, and all this was socially distanced, of course, they said, what we're going to do is we're going to take a knee, and while you take a knee, we're going to read out all the names of the Unison members that we know of who've died as a result of the pandemic. We were on our knees for some considerable time. And also what was really clear was how many of those names were people who were either of African descent or people of Asian descent. And of course, on top of that, you've got, my name's not particularly easily recognizable as being of African descent or Asian descent. So what we did know was individuals on there as well who had died in the course of doing their jobs. And the bottom line to this is that so many public service workers, but in particular, so many black workers were deliberately, in my view, put in harm's way. They were put in harm's way without PPE. They were, and quite often it wasn't because the PPE wasn't available. We came across plenty of examples of where the employer had the PPE, but kept it in a cupboard and wouldn't give it to the workers. Now, for me, that's murder or manslaughter, but willfully putting somebody in harm's way. And of course, out of that, what we found was that there were so many black workers who were being put in harm's way at that. Now, if you think right back to the beginning of the pandemic, certainly in the UK, I can talk about, then people simply had no PPE, nothing, and they were expected to go in and provide care without any protection whatsoever. They were being promised that the PPE would arrive tomorrow. The personal protective equipment will arrive tomorrow. And it didn't. And then they were told, well, it'll arrive the day after, and it still didn't. But in the meantime, people were dying, not just patients, but people who were trying to provide care for their patients. And what we often is often forgotten, I think, in this, and I think this has come out in the conversation so far, is that things weren't brilliant for black workers before the pandemic. It was really hard, it was really bad, and particularly with when you look at social care and who provides social care in the UK. Now, I do go way back into the, starting my working life in the early 1980s as a local government worker. And I was a member of the National Union of Public Employees, and I was a shop steward for them. It was the first role I'd had as a shop steward, and the area that I represented was in a town called Walsall, where I was born, and I was a member of Walsall Social Services branch of Walsall of NUPE. And the reason I mention that is because all the members that I represented worked in publicly run care homes, publicly run, publicly accountable and run. I have to say, at that time, few black workers getting into those jobs as well, very few getting into those jobs. It took a long, hard struggle to get into those jobs. Now, where we are in the UK, it's 90+% of all the care provision, social care provision in the UK is provided by the private sector. And now we're at a position where a large proportion, I don't know the exact numbers, but a large proportion of the people working in the private care sector, the social care sector, privately run, private companies, are black or migrant workers. So there's been a massive change in that period. But I'll tell you what hasn't changed, because I saw this in the early 1980s, but I see it now when I talk to care workers, is the level of exploitation of those workers and the levels of racism that people are having to put up with. Black workers up and down the UK being told that you have no choice but to come in and sleep in at these care homes. We're not giving you a choice. If you don't like it, you will lose your job, right? And that's what has been happening. So people being threatened with losing their job. And if they didn't accept this, then that's what was going to happen. So not only were they being put in harm's way, but they were being told that you haven't got a choice about being put in harm's way. Even when the personal protective equipment finally came on stream, people were still being told that you have no real employment rights in these situations. Private sector companies whose only thing about providing social care isn't about the care, it's about profits. And we have to remember that. So they're prepared to put people in harm's way for profit. And that is what many black workers up and down this country are experiencing in social care. Now, of course, what we're also seeing in social care is that this is one of the poorest organised areas for trade unions. And that's the truth of the matter. I have to say now, I've managed to, last year, I managed to persuade Unison that this had to be a national organising priority of the union. And that's what we now have. We have a programme of trying to organise this sector much more effectively than it has been in the past. Not just because of COVID, because I got them to agree that before COVID really started to bite. But what we do know is that there are so many black workers within this sector who are at risk, just at risk. And we have to be able to do something about that, because what we can't do is just expect in such a poorly organised area that there's capacity for people to come into those workplaces from outside and somehow be the cavalry coming to the rescue of these workers. The only way organising succeeds is if workers have power within their own workplaces. And that's the way that we are approaching this, is to help build power for workers in the social care. And what that means for us is power for so many more black workers who are so vulnerable at the minute. And that is crucial if we're to tackle the racism that I think is just so virulent at the moment across social care, but also across the National Health Service and also across local government, all part of the fight back against this pandemic. Let me just, in conclusion, just finish off by talking a little bit about what's ahead of us, because we haven't said that so far. And what's ahead of us is so many black workers are about to lose their jobs, right? These are jobs that we have fought, as I've illustrated already. So many black workers who have fought long and hard to get into the public services even at the bottom levels, even where we can't get promotion, even when we can't get training to get promotion, we have managed to get into these sectors. And many of these jobs now, through public service cuts of this government, this incompetent government, whose day is must face a day of reckoning in the UK. So many of those workers are now being threatened with losing their jobs. We have employers across the UK who are using Conservative Party legislation to sack workers and to re-engage them on worse terms and conditions. That's what's happening. And so many black workers are experiencing that at the moment. And frankly, I have to say, they're not just Tory, Conservative employers who are doing that. There's Labour councils doing that as well. There's employers who've got senior Labour figures in them as well. And we have to be standing up against that, because this is the danger for black workers, as well as the deaths that we're experiencing, is that now we're going to face the perfect storm. The perfect storm of deaths at work, being put in harm's way, facing death in the workplace, but also having worked so hard within the public sector to save lives, our jobs will go. And that's why it's important that we have to build power for our members within their workplaces. It's really important that we build our movements, not just the trade union movement per se, but we build black worker organisation across the trade union movement and across the public sector and across all of those areas that are working so hard within this. Because frankly, and I have to say very bluntly in conclusion, because it's always been the case, I never wait for a knight in shining armour to come to my rescue, because it's never, ever happened. The only way we as black workers have ever made progress is when we do things like this and when we organise collectively together. And that's what we're going to have to do if we're really going to need to stand up against this massive threat that this pandemic poses for us in the way that it affects us as black workers, as black community, but also in terms of the aftermath and the way that many of our people are going to be threatened or actually will lose their jobs. So it's up to us to stand up, organise and make a difference for the people working next to us who are just facing that perfect storm at the minute. Thanks, Chidi.
Thank you, Roger. And indeed, as you say, the key solution, or a key solution to much of what we're dealing with is in building workers' power, and that power to organize ourselves, in defense of their own interest. Easier said than done. So I'm going to come back to you on that a little bit later. And also, of course, political organizing, which I think was inherent in much of what you said there as well. Not only organizing within our workplaces, but also, ensuring that power reaches those in decision-making roles that affect and touch all of our lives, both inside and outside the workplace. And yes, that warning, and we're seeing it happening already across Europe, what you mentioned about so many employers using this situation as an excuse to rewrite contracts, which in many cases were already precarious contracts, but to put workers on even more precarious contracts. And knowing again that, and this is what we are also picking up from other affiliates in Europe, that this is again having a particularly deleterious effect on Black and racialized communities. The fact that many workers, again, racialized workers, have fallen through any of the emergency social measures, social protection measures that governments have rushed to put in place. And as regards migrant workers, we've also seen the situation of migrant workers literally being stranded at borders because their employment has come to an end. They're not included in any measures that governments put in place. They then end up in situations where they are undocumented and irregular in the country, but cannot leave, cannot access social protection, cannot access any means of livelihood. And we know of the particularly nasty situation that we've had in the UK, but repeated in other European countries in terms of migrant workers being able to access health and care services, and the whole scandal that we had around the Windrush generation of people whose citizenship was suddenly taken away from them. And I think that's a good point on which to go across to Italy. Mercedes, I don't know if Ibrahima.
No, que Ibrahim
Oui, je suis
está
avec vous, je suis
esperando
en
que le
train de
activen
suivre.
la cámara, por favor.
Okay.
Vi sto seguendo. Oi, Mercedes.
Sí. Hola, él dice que está siguiendo, pero no tiene acceso a la cámara. Tú, Chidi, lo puedes attivar.
No, l'avete bloccato voi, è l'ospite che l'ha bloccato, quindi non...
Sì, è quello che sto dicendo, Ibrahim. Sto chiedendo di aprirle. Marí, por favor, ¿puedes abrirle la cámara a Niane?
Okay, so Farid, I don't know if you caught that, but Mercedes was asking if you can open Ibrahima's camera or activate his video, I guess, as host. But in any event, I presume you will speak in French, seeing as we don't have Italian interpretation.
¿Verdad? Ibrahim, parli in francese. Ibrahim?
Sì? Mi senti?
Sì.
Est-ce que vous allez parler en français?
Parla.
No, intervengo in italiano se non volete mettermi in difficoltà.
Francese.
Altrimenti devo andare a prendere il dizionario per...
Mais est-ce que vous pouvez nous parler en français parce qu'on n'a pas interprétation vers l'italien, malheureusement.
Il fallait me le dire avant parce que j'aurais pu prévoir quand même une intervention en français parce que...
Bueno, si habla en italiano, yo le traduzco.
Ah, ok. Fai la traduzione, Mercedes.
Okay, so just for everybody to follow, Ibrahima will speak in Italian and Mercedes will help us with, I guess, consecutive interpretation from Italian into English. I don't know how that works with our interpreters in order to... Okay, into Espanol. I don't know how our interpreters will then so I think we're going to have 3 relays. So the interpreters, I guess, will translate from Spanish into English after Mercedes. Right? So Mercedes, you will interpret from Italian into Spanish, and then we will have interpretation from Spanish into English. Okay, go ahead.
Possiamo... Comunque la video non va, quindi intervengo così, cioè non perdete nulla, quindi...
Come?
No, sto dicendo che anche la video non funziona, quindi intervengo così, cioè non sono problemi.
Sí, pero si le pueden activar la cámara, por favor.
Mercedes, no creo que es posible.
La cámara, no.
Sí, pero Niane tiene que activar a su mismo cámara, pero...
Dice che la deve attivare te, Ibrahim.
Io l'ho provato 1000 volte, altrimenti devo uscire e rientrare ancora, ma così ho provato 1000 volte, ma non funziona. Mi dice che sempre è stato interrotto dall'ospite, quindi...
Dice que es el anfitrión que lo tiene bloqueado. Okay. Bueno.
Esco, rientro, se volete esco e rientro ancora. Se non...
No, quédate ahí. Facciamo così.
Okay, so over to you, Nian. Unfortunately, he cannot activate his camera, so we can't have him on screen, but please, I will, no sé, creo que yo debo hablar en español para que tú puedes traducir para Niane.
Puoi
suppongo.
cominciare, Ibrahim.
Sì, ho visto cioè il webinar che si sta facendo sui temi della crisi Covid, quello che ha riportato anche sul mondo dell'immigrazione. Poi Mercedes, dimmi se vado veloce, magari mi rallento, cioè cerco di, per consentirti di poter fare una traduzione più simultanea.
Sí, por ahora está bien, tengo que hacerlo en consecutiva.
Ok.
Per ora va bene.
Per ora va bene. È sicuramente una situazione che non aiuta, una situazione molto difficile nel mondo dell'immigrazione e stiamo vedendo nel mondo del lavoro soprattutto tantissimi che durante il Covid non riescono più a recuperare le funzionalità che avevano prima. Sono i primi lavoratori che stanno pagando la crisi, come diciamo sempre, perché questo possiamo
Dice
denominarlo.
que la situación se ha deteriorado ulteriormente para los inmigrantes, que son los primeros que están pagando la situación que se está verificando con efecto de la crisis de contagio.
Se guardiamo il mondo del lavoro, tantissimi sono ancora in cassa integrazione e sono i primi che lasciano sempre a casa.
Hay muchos en el mundo del trabajo que están recibiendo los subsidios del gobierno.
Prendendo la cassa integrazione, addirittura non riescono neanche più ad andare a trovare i familiari per tutte le misure che riguardano comunque il lockdown, cioè le zone rosse, le zone sulla quale oggi le persone fanno fatica a muoversi.
Pero tomando esos subsidios del gobierno no pueden desplazarse porque con todas las medidas que han tomado hay muchas prohibiciones y muchas limitaciones para la movilidad.
Poi ci sono quelli che devono comunque al ritorno li lasciano a casa perché sai, se uno ha solo 2 settimane per andare a trovare la famiglia, al ritorno deve fare anche l'isolamento fiduciario e questo sta creando un conflitto tra datori di lavoro e lavoratori.
Se está creando un conflicto también entre empleadores y trabajadores porque muchos cuando van a sus lugares de origen a visitar la familia, al regresar tienen que pasar un periodo largo de cuarentena, entonces eso le crea un problema de crisis de relación con el empleador.
Quelli che facevano la formazione, che devono fare la formazione, oggi non riescono neanche a fare la formazione per poter continuare a lavorare perché ci sono le scuole
Incluso
chiuse,
los que tienen que trabajar, los que tienen que hacer capacitación porque está incluido dentro del trabajo, no la pueden hacer. Están limitados de hacer la capacitación.
Questo riguarda il mondo del lavoro, su quelli che avevano le posti di lavoro, ma ci sono una
Sorry
serie...
to butt in. It's just that we have two interpreters coming in on the English channel at the moment. Both are excellent, but yeah, I think if we could just have one interpreter coming through the English channel, that would be really helpful. Thank you. Thanks very much.
No entendí lo que dijiste, Chidi.
Come? Mi senti, Mercedes?
Sì, ti sento, però non so.
Okay, and we had a female voice coming through as well. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Guy.
No entendí, Chidi, ¿qué decías?
Posso continuare?
Sì.
No, dicevo, questo riguarda il mondo del lavoro, riguarda le persone che sono nella produzione, ma ci sono migliaia e migliaia di persone che non avevano un lavoro e oggi non riescono neanche a entrare nel mercato del lavoro.
Esto es lo que tiene que ver con las personas que ya estaban insertadas en el mundo del trabajo, pero hay miles y miles de personas que no tenían un trabajo y que ahora les es mucho más difícil poder encontrar un trabajo en este momento.
E i sussidi che lo Stato sta mettendo a disposizione sono intermittenti, non coprono tutti i periodi, magari se prendiamo il reddito di emergenza, che sono misure a spot che garantisce magari per un mese un sussidio e per altri mesi non hai niente. Quindi sono persone che oggi sono nel bailame delle normative che non gli consente di avere un sussidio, ma con il Covid non riescono neanche a lavorare perché le aziende non hanno produzione.
Y los subsidios que el gobierno pone a disposición son esporádicos y eso no le permite, sobre todo, subsistir y tienen problemas porque tampoco las empresas tienen acceso a con todas las leyes y los decretos che hanno emitido, no tienen possibilità di regolarizzare questa situazione.
Ci sono anche tantissimi che magari sono dei venditori, sono persone che lavorano nel settore informale che magari non riescono più, perché visto che tutti devono stare a casa, non possono uscire, queste persone non hanno neanche delle certificazioni, sono tutte quelle persone che oggi non hanno la possibilità di andare a lavorare perché le restrizioni sono tante, sono in casa, non riescono neanche più a pagare l'affitto e rientrano nella nuova povertà.
Bueno, hay otra platea que es también muy grande, que están completamente marginados de todas las posibilidades, que son, por ejemplo, los trabajadores informales, especialmente los vendedores ambulantes, que no pueden salir por las restricciones, pero tampoco están ganando, están recibiendo una renta, no pueden pagar un alquiler, y entonces eso ha agravado la situación de esa platea que es importante numéricamente de personas.
Donc aujourd'hui, nous avons deux types de personnes. Les gens qui ont gente che ha già il posto di lavoro, ma con il sussidio della cassa integrazione fa fatica a arrivare a fine mese, e quelli che non hanno nulla e sono lì. Quindi sono due estremi che tra l'altro si conoscono perché possono essere persone dello stesso paese, persone che arrivano magari dall'Africa, persone che arrivano dai paesi dell'est che magari riescono cioè quelli dell'est riescono magari a rientrare a casa perché magari cioè quelli che arrivano da altri continenti magari rimangono qui bloccati perché non hanno neanche i soldi per pagare il biglietto per rientrare nel loro paese.
Existen esos dos extremos, los que reciben subsidio porque ya estaban en el mundo del trabajo y los que no reciben nada. Y dentro de ese grupo, el segundo grupo, están los que vienen, los inmigrantes de los países del este de Europa, que tienen tal vez la posibilidad de volver a sus países, pero los que vienen de otras áreas más lejanas, les es difícil hasta eso.
E le compagnie aeree non riescono a pagare il biglietto perché magari tante compagnie hanno i biglietti che costano caro e che oggi non c'è la possibilità di poter avere una politica di accompagnamento per poter venire incontro. E questi problemi qua magari chi lavora, il sindacato può intervenire per chiedere le persone che lavorano magari nel sistema informale, che magari lavorano nei mercati, che fanno il lavoro informale perché vendono i loro prodotti, vivono dell'arte, non hanno la possibilità di associazioni che magari li rivendicano i loro diritti e magari cercano di dargli un supporto per poter comunque arrivare a far sì che il governo nelle politiche di aiuti li prendano in considerazione.
No hay tampoco una política que pueda acompañar a las personas que lo deseen o lo necesiten volver a sus países. Las líneas aéreas han puesto los pasajes muy caros y estas personas que están al margen porque no reciben ningún tipo de subsidio, no tienen dinero, incluso no hay entre todas las leyes que han emitido ningún tipo, no se contempla ningún tipo de apoyo y de ayuda para esta población.
Donc le difficoltà sono tante, soprattutto nel mondo dell'immigrazione perché non hanno una rete familiare, sono persone che oggi vivono condizioni molto difficili e che su questo noi quello che vediamo tutti i giorni qui anche nel nostro punto di lavoro che tanta gente è disperata che non hanno più la casa, non sanno dove dormire, vengono di tutto e di più, ma non soltanto chi lavora, ma la disperazione della gente. E più va avanti, più sarà peggio.
Sí, es una situación que la tendencia es a empeorar, porque se trata de personas que no tienen trabajo, no reciben subsidio y tampoco tienen red familiar de apoyo. No hay ningún sostén y entonces la perspectiva es que esto simplemente empeore.
E noi abbiamo anche un'altra preoccupazione che vediamo, tantissimo sulla questione sanitaria, perché voi sapete che gli ospedali non ricevono quasi più, i medici bisogna prendere appuntamento, le persone che erano nella clandestinità o magari nella situazione di irregolari, che oggi come facciamo a mapparli, sapere quali sono i bisogni che hanno, è un aiuto anche alla tutela sanitaria, quindi diventa una questione sanitaria, perché prima si parla del Covid, ma ci sono anche tutte le malattie connesse che oggi queste persone non hanno un punto di riferimento e questo si
Y,
vede perché tante volte vengono a chiedersi aiuto perché devono fare una visita e che magari non c'è una struttura appropriata per poterli accompagnare.
y otro problema es lo que tiene que ver con la salud, porque muchas son personas irregulares que no tenían documentos, que no tenían acceso formal a la salud. Y en esta situación donde se está fundamentalmente atendiendo enfermos de COVID y los otros se están descuidando, para las personas que están al margen de los servicios, de la garantía de los servicios de salud, la situación es todavía más precaria porque se quedan simplemente fuera.
Quindi la fragilità di queste persone riguarda soprattutto il mondo dell'immigrazione, avere persone che riescono a tradurre questi bisogni che hanno questi immigrati. Quindi sancire o mappare i problemi è vero, ma il problema è la catena trainante che potrà far diventare una rivendicazione questi problemi. Chi lo fa e come lo possiamo fare?
La cuestión que se plantea es, de acuerdo con hacer un mapa de las diferentes situaciones, pero sobre todo es la cadena que pueda alar a todas esas situaciones y ponerlas en evidencia, que salgan a flote, y de manera que quién se va a encargar de enfrentarlas y de poder buscar respuestas.
Possiamo star qui fino a domani a elencare i problemi. Vi posso dire, potrei aggiungere una serie di cose che oggi noi vediamo nel nostro punto più avanzato perché magari lavoriamo nel sociale, nel sindacato, quindi tramite le associazioni. I pacchi viveri che prepariamo per le persone che sono sul territorio è diventato sempre una cosa più pressante perché le domande sono tante, perché le persone oggi non hanno un fonte di reddito e il mondo dell'immigrazione paga di più le conseguenze perché sono persone e c'è l'altro lato di queste persone che sono arrivate come rifugiati politici o magari tramite i barconi che oggi non prendono più in considerazione tramite i vari progetti perché magari il progetto che gli è finita non hanno avuto la risposta positiva da parte delle questure e che queste persone sono fuori e c'è anche il freddo, quindi ci sono tutte queste situazioni che oggi il coronavirus ha portato più alla luce.
Okay. Sí, podemos estar aquí hasta mañana haciendo una lista de todos los problemas, porque hay todavía muchas otras cuestiones que enfrentar. Por ejemplo, en el trabajo social y también sindical, estamos incluso distribuyendo paquetes de alimentos para personas que no tienen otra fuente. Y sobre todo, otra área que queda muy penalizada es la de las personas que piden asilo, los que han venido con las embarcaciones frágiles, por ejemplo, atravesando el Mediterráneo, porque todos los programas que había se han debilitado en este tiempo. Entonces hay problemas para dar respuesta incluso a las personas que piden asilo político. Bueno.
Perché gli spazi sono pochi, poi con il Corano non puoi avere l'assembramento, non puoi avere tanti posti sulla quale tenerli e a questo punto penso che tutti questi problemi devono essere discussi a livello europeo, quindi avete fatto bene a organizzare questo webinar per confrontarsi e condividere i problemi che ci sono. Mi auguro che dopo aver raccolto questi problemi che diventa un contenitore ma avere un punto di riferimento nei vari canali che ognuno di noi ha per poter far sì che le politiche di aiuto arrivano anche alla gente che non hanno oggi persone che li difendono.
Es importante haber hecho esta reunión porque así vemos las situaciones que hay en los diferentes países y podemos juntarlos y ver si lo enfrentamos y buscamos soluciones comunes a partir del el lugar donde cada uno está y la posición desde donde cada uno está en los diferentes lugares.
Chiudo su un punto che secondo me riguarda anche tutte le ambasciate dei paesi europei, nei paesi di provenienza dei migranti, perché tutti quelli che avevano la documentazione da tradurre o chiedere il visto di reingresso perché durante il Covid erano già dall'altra parte e non potevano più ritornare perché c'era il lockdown, per avere i visti di reingresso tutte le ambasciate magari sono chiuse e non riescono a ricevere le persone. Anche chi ha fatto il ricongiungimento familiare e che oggi il nulla osta sta scadendo all'interno delle ambasciate perché le prefetture non rilasciano più il cartaceo perché non ricevono pubblico, quindi mandano la documentazione tramite posta certificata alle autorità consolari che non ricevono anche gente, quindi bisogna trovare una formula per far sì che queste persone riescano ad avere i visti nei tempi dovuti o magari quando si riprende non devono rifare tutte le pratiche. Anche questa è una questione burocrática.
Para concluir, otra cuestión es ver el problema de las embajadas que están cerradas y que hay muchas personas que tienen, están corriendo el riesgo y está sucediendo que le caduquen los documentos, sea para renovar, sea para las visas de reingreso. Entonces, habría que buscar un mecanismo para enfrentar también esa situación de personas que podrían caer en la irregularidad por la cuestión de las embajadas y los consulados cerrados.
L'altro per chiudere davvero è la questione dei tamponi o delle analisi che oggi queste persone magari dimenticati non hanno nessuna copertura, non riescono a fare né tampone né prevenzione. E figuriamoci sulle vaccinazioni, che secondo me è un altro problema sulla quale bisogna tenere alta la presione per far sì che anche la gente dimenticata riesca a avere le vaccinazioni.
Y realmente, para cerrar, está el problema de la dificultad que tienen las personas para hacerse la prueba diagnóstica de COVID, que ustedes saben que son pagando para, si no es que te manda el médico, y el problema será todavía o se está ya presentando más difícil en lo que respecta a las vacunas, que tampoco parece que tendrán acceso a las vacunas. ¿Está bien así, Ibrahim?
Okay, thank you.
Ok. Nada, gracias, Ibrahim. Excúsennos.
Se non avete domande, sì.
And thank you to Mercedes for being the relay from Italian to Spanish and allowing us to listen in English. I'm very grateful for that, and thank you, Ibrahima, for your intervention. And we've heard very similar stories from all panelists. And one of the things I think it really brings to mind is I know that the UK is now out of Europe, but it highlights the the deep changes that have gone through a Europe that was built on a social pillar to a Europe now that is really, don't know what I would call it actually, but we know that most European countries have swung very much to the far right. Far right is very much the mainstream now in many European countries, with all that entails in terms of a worsening situation from Black and racialized communities. So we know what the problem is. The big question now that I'm going to ask all of you to deal with in 5 minutes, simply because we are unfortunately short now on time, is what do we do about it? What do we do about it? And I'm going to go first now, to Roger, and then to Jeku, and then to Wilf, and then to Ibrahim. So Roger, what do we do?
I think, yeah, thanks. I think I touched on this during my earlier contribution, because for me, organising is the key. You know, we can complain about all of this stuff as much as we like, but actually we need to, as Black workers, to be organising across borders as well as within our own borders as well. And that's why I think GAWI is so important, because it gives us an opportunity to have these sorts of conversations, but also when times allow, just to enable us to build these networks that are actually going to reach down into workplaces, reach down into communities, to start the process of empowering Black workers, because a lot of the issues that we've talked about are not new. We've been talking about these things for some considerable time. I mean, there's plenty of people on this call who I've been working with for many, many years, including yourself, Chidi and Wilf, these are issues we've been talking about for some time, and the answer is still the same. We cannot rely on other people to take these issues up, especially at a time when racism and the far right in particular are in such ascendancy at the moment. We have to build our own capacity to be able to make a difference. It's for me the key. The only question that remains, and we haven't got time to deal with it on this call, is how we go about doing that practically, how we can use this time of lockdown, and then what do we do after lockdown has ended to make that real difference. Thanks.
Thanks, Roger. Indeed, and hopefully these sorts of convenings virtually, I guess that's one thing we can thank COVID for, is that it's made us connect with each other, albeit virtually, perhaps a lot more, but perhaps through this we can start to build those bridges of solidarity that you are talking about there, Roger. Ojeko, coming back to you, I mean, we've seen this organizing happening, as a result of many things, but especially the revival, if you like, of the Black Lives Movement, not only in the US, but across the world, including across Europe, as a result of the murder of George Floyd, which Roger spoke about earlier on. So how do we build on this moment and ensure that in our organizing, we're bringing in these progressive and grassroots and sometimes spontaneous, demonstrations or manifestations of Black people organizing themselves to promote or defend or demand their own rights.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and it's something that we have been trying to discuss with our members, especially after the death of George Floyd, and this global uprising, which has been one of the largest that we have seen, and I think that there are such links or connection between Black people's experience of policing, the oppression and repressive tactics of the police. And during that period, I think it made a huge difference in terms of why people were again coming back to march under this banner of Black Lives Matter. And, all the work that colleagues are doing, we are doing as an anti-racist network over the years, the Black Lives Matter campaign over the years, it will build, and at moments it will progress the organizing and the momentum forward. We have seen, I think, though, in the summer, a huge support of Black Lives Matter. Now, I don't know if the support is as strong in the general public, but I think that people, Black people, racialized groups can see that the Black Lives Matter movement is more than just about policing. What it's talking about is power. And it's a demand for saying that Black people matter, whether it's in the treatment from the police, or in employment, or in healthcare. This is what the movement is also about. And I think that we have to continue to challenge this and struggle against those who have the power and don't want to let it go. I mean, we see what's happening in the US, we see what's happening in many of the countries in Europe in terms of white supremacy, far-right, extremist governments and groups. And we as racialized groups, we need to continue to do our work to address some of this power imbalance. And I think in a way, those extremist groups are concerned by us, demanding that Black Lives Matter, and trying to ensure that we have the power. And the power is not just in us being on the street or protest. We want to see the change in policy. This is really important, because until we see changes in policy, we will still be experiencing the inequity, the unfairness in the structural ways in which we've all talked about how this pandemic is affecting racialized groups. So, I mean, I want to say in terms of the EU and in terms of policy, the policy agenda, I think we see some recognition in the latest EU action plan on integration and inclusion of the work that racialized groups do, migrant groups do in Europe. There's a recognition in the text that these are key workers, essential workers, but the solutions don't really even go far enough, really. And I think that this is a crisis of health, a health crisis. It's a crisis in terms of racism and discrimination, but it's also a crisis in terms of the economy. And from my understanding and my work in the UK, I know that from the last global economic crisis we had in 2008, racialized groups it was slower for them to kind of come back to the average. So they were more likely to be unemployed, they were more likely to have a lower pay. All of these sorts of statistics was a problem for racialized groups. And I'm really concerned if we don't have policies that mitigate this for Black people, racialized workers, it will be the same thing in the years to come. So there are really practical ways in terms of policies that we can address, mitigate some of the issues. Our colleague Ibrahima highlighted a lot of things in terms of access to embassies. All of these sorts of things need to be ensured for migrant workers, ability to have bank accounts so that they can, just have stimulus checks, all of these sorts of things. There are many ways in which you can address it in terms of mitigating policies. And we have a lot to do. I think it was hundreds of billions of euros has been earmarked for the economic recovery of Europe. Most of it is going to grants to EU member states, EU member states like Italy and Spain. How is this funding? How is this recovery plan going to address some of the issues for Black workers, Black people in Europe? And we have some suggestions, we have some examples, but we really we need to mobilize and we need to make some demands, because unless the EU leaders actually acknowledge that we exist here in Europe, and that they need to have these mitigating policies, nothing is going to come to us. So we have a lot of work to do, basically.
Thank you very much, Rijeko. And in fact, we had invited also Daniela Obono from the French National Assembly to join us, but she wasn't able to make it, which is a shame because it would have been good to get the view from a politician as well, who is also, even in her field, facing many of the challenges that you have you've all outlined, and seeing how we, again, in terms of building movements, in terms of organizing ourselves, we also connect, allies and our members of our community who are in political positions in our countries. Wilf, back to you on this question.
Yeah, thank you, Chidi. I mean, I think, Roger hit it on the head when he said we need to organise, and we need to organise internationally. But alongside that, we need to repoliticise race. We need to get people to understand that the fight against racism is a fight against exploitation and for democracy and human rights, because somehow it's become a fight about how people are individually treated. But that's part of the ideology of individualism and consumerism that's pushed on us, and so we have to, I think, seize the narrative, because I think, one of the things that often happens is that people talk about fighting racism as if we all live in a world where actually ultimately, people want to see racism defeated. And it's almost like it's a historical legacy from the past. But the reality is that there's people out there that cynically deploy racism to maintain their power and position and wealth. And that is at the basis of which we have to start challenging this. So we have to repoliticise the fight against racism and people's understanding of what racism is about. We have to understand that there's an opposition. These people on the far right aren't just a mad bunch of people. They've been there all the time. They organise. Right, and that's why it's a struggle. We have to understand we have a political opposition that will continue to put things in place to intensify the exploitation against us. And on that point, people often say, well, things are getting worse because of the pandemic. If people follow what was happening in the economy, things were getting worse anyway. All that the pandemic has done is disguise the economic crash, which was already in slow progress, across the world economy. And the implications for us as black workers, not just in terms of work, but in terms of how we can move, what's happening in terms of the environment, what's happening in terms of the global south, are huge. And that's why we have to organise internationally. And finally, we have to start seizing control of the narrative. One of the things that we know both, but it's not just in America, in Britain, is that right-wing governments and conservative-based governments are at the moment engaging in a culture war. They're trying to undermine the idea that there is such a thing as institutional racism or state racism, and that, once again, blame the victim. And we have to be aware of those tactics. So we have to collectivise. We have to insist that this is a collective issue. That actually it's not just an issue for black workers and black communities. It's an issue about the future of our planet and the way we live.
Thank you, Wilf. Very strong words. Unfortunately, we also lost Ibrahima. I don't know if he's able to come back in. I've asked Farid to look out for him because I can't let him in as host. But absolutely, I think you all hit the nail on the head with your interventions, and I think we will heed that call to repoliticize race and acknowledge that what we're up against is something that is built into our system. That's what we say when we talk about systemic and structural racism, right? The fact that our whole global capitalist system is built on the subjugation of Black workers and women workers, and especially Black women workers, if I can put it that way. And until we recognize and acknowledge that, then we're really tinkering around the edges of the problem rather than getting to the root of it. That also means challenging our own organizations and institutions, the very organizations and institutions that are supposed to be defending workers' rights and building workers' power, but very often that does not include Black workers at all. And I put it out there because I think it's something important for us to reflect on and re-engage on, that very often our movement seems to be moving away from a class-based movement into more of some sort of elitist movement. And I think GAWI has a very strong role to play in reorienting at least the focus of Black workers within the movement, bringing along, as you say, the all-important allies, because we can't do this by us isolating ourselves. We need to find those who need to work with us. We're really coming to the end of this. Otherwise, I would have asked Roger in particular just to talk a little bit more about some of the ridiculous politics which illustrate what our speakers have said that are playing out in the UK with our own Labour Party and the trade union movement, which again just re-emphasizes what you said, both about the need to
we can have 190 minutes on that one.
We certainly could.
And you may cost me my job.
No, we can't do that. We can't put your job at risk, but in that sense. But I think maybe a discussion for a future GAWI get together.
Yeah, that's a discussion over a drink or three.
Indeed, but yes, indeed, building that political power, repoliticizing race, changing the narrative are all key. And I hope, as I say, that this will be the first in a series of discussions that will help us organize across borders, that will connect us to other GAWI members, people who are interested in the work of GAWI in different parts of the world. So please watch out for the next webinar, which I believe will be for Central Africa, if I've got that right. Kwazi, please correct me, but that's coming up, I think, on the 28th of January. So to close off, and Ibrahima, I see you're back in, and I'm so sorry that you dropped off and it's taking us this long to get you back in. Perhaps, Mercedes, you can communicate that to him, but we've come to the end of the allocated time. So I just want to thank everybody. If Ibrahima had anything to say in the last minute that we have left for the webinar session, very happy for him to communicate that. And we have the camera as well. So, hi. So the final word will go to you, Ibrahima, before we close down this webinar. But before I hand over the mic, let me just also thank all of you, all our presenters, our panelists, and of course, the interpreters who have helped us to communicate in different languages. Thank you. So Ibrahima, any final words for the session?
Dicevi, ho perso un pezzo.
Dice che ha perdido un pedazo, però di, se tu quieres, se vuoi dire qualcosa velocemente perché la chiusura.
No, ringrazio tutti per la disponibilità e penso che dobbiamo organizzarsi e continuare a tenersi in contatto per far uscire tutti i problemi che hanno gli ultimi, come si chiamano sempre, e la difesa dei nostri diritti passa attraverso il coordinamento, e la battaglia deve essere una battaglia mondiale, europeo, e che non può essere soltanto ogni Stato, ma tutti noi dobbiamo mettersi in gioco e lavorare bene per difendere i diritti dei nostri.
Sí, darle las gracias a todos por la oportunidad y bueno, que la cuestión es organizarnos, estar organizados para poder enfrentar todas estos desafíos que tenemos por delante, sobre todo la defensa de los derechos de los mal llamados últimos, de los susodichos últimos, que eso es lo que tenemos por delante y es lo que tenemos que hacer. Gracias, dice.
Va bene. Grazie.
Thank you very much, and thank you everybody. And with that, I think yeah, we come to the end of this particular webinar session. As I say, please do watch out for the webinar series that GAWI is hosting, and we hope to see you again shortly. Thank you very much. And bye.
Gracias.
And ciao. Thank you, interpreters. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Good to see you all.
Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Fantastic speakers. Thank you.
You're around on Friday.
Yeah.
Okay, right.
Okay.
I'll send you a link.
Agripina.
Just let me know the best time. Okay.
Okay. Perfecto. Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Hola, Agripina, Juan Diego. Chiku. Ciao.
Bye. Bye, Chidi. Bye.
Bye. Bye.